children's rights law. And she even has an advanced degree on international law where she really focused on international gender law, and has worked as a consultant in Lebanon and Ethiopia, and was recently the director of the U.S. section of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, one of our great sister organizations. And we are especially proud because Tanya is going to be joining our staff as a public policy director, and we're thrilled to have her expertise and passion as well as her wonderful personality to work with. And we're really excited that she's going to talk to you today about the progress that we're making, and we'll talk a little bit about the things that you can do to help with women, peace, and security.
Hi, this is Tanya. I assume I'm on now. Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Kathy and Udzi. I'm really, really excited to be part of WAND and to be here with all of you today as discussing women as peace partners in our Women, Peace, and Security agenda. I want to particularly just remind all of us that today is actually the 11th anniversary of 9/11. So it's particularly poignant that we're really talking about how to expand our capacity for really building sustainable and just peace throughout our world, and to do that particularly by bringing women in as equal partners. So to begin, let's just get started. So the goal of Women, Peace, and Security, is simple as it is profound. And this is taken from the U.S. National Action Plan released last December. It states to empower half the world's population as equal partners in preventing conflict and building peace in countries threatened and affected by war, violence, and insecurity. However, it notes that achieving this goal is critical to both our national and global security. Today I'm going to cover four areas, but particularly three substantive areas. First, I assume that not everyone on this call today was, joined us for our WAND's webinar on UN Security Council Resolution 1325 this time last fall. So we'll give a brief overview and background since it is really Security Council Resolution 1325 that frames the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, and then the U.S. National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. And then we will jump to an overview of the U.S. National Action Plan, its prime components, and how it's really extraordinarily shifting and changing how the U.S. engages in its foreign policy in regards to the role of women. And then I'd like to bring us to the most recent action, which just came out this past August 1st, 2012. Congress introduced the Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2012 to ensure the effective implementation of the U.S. NAP. So we'll talk about that, and then we'll look at some action items. And I believe that Kathy will also take us to some WAND action items we have lined up for there. So, as an overview, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 was a resolution passed unanimously in October 2000, and the goal of it was to realize that peace agreements and security matters that didn't recognize the unique role of women in the process, whether it's as participants, whether it's as beneficiaries, or whether it's as victims, was resulting in ineffective and unsustainable peace resolutions and recurring conflict. So this resolution was passed, and then there were subsequent resolutions similarly passed by the UN Security Council, 1820, 1888, 1889, and 1960. And together these all make up what we refer to as the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, or WPS. And the follow-up resolutions primarily address sexual violence, women in conflict, and women's participation in government and peace processes. But fundamentally, the goal of the entire Women, Peace, and Security agenda is the full and equal participation of women in all peace and security matters. So there's 5 key commitments within the Resolution 1325, and the first is participation. It's really looking at the participation of women in decision-making roles, and so that, we call this a gender balance at all levels of decision-making. And I think that most of us can think about when we're looking at those decision-making bodies. We're lucky if we see a handful of women, and most of the time it's maybe 1 or 2, right? So when we're talking about half the population of the world, that their perspectives, voices, views, how these major global security decisions impact them and their immediate lives and their families, to not have those perspectives, views, and experiences included in the decision-making process, it's not surprising that we're not creating, agreements that are sustainable. It's just not recognizing the needs or views of half the population. So participation is really starting to increase women's high-level and political participation at all levels. The next is a gender perspective, and this is largely often framed within a post-conflict processes and peacekeeping. We've often, or particularly within the last 20 years, so many of our global conflicts have really seen a particular unique impact on women in the post-conflict process, whether that's just that, women that are in refugee camps or in towns where there's been significant destruction that are trying to go get water or food, and they're raped along the way. I mean, that's a unique situation to the women involved in that process. But then also how security forces engage with women has created numerous unique outcomes specific to women. And then that follows to protection. Protection of and the respect for the human rights of women and girls. Really starting to see rape as a tool of, as a tool and weapon of war. Ensuring that women and girls' human rights are protected through all peace and security processes. And then conflict prevention. Again, this is recognizing that women, really have a unique role in conflict prevention. And later I'll give some key examples of where that has occurred. And then, the last, and then the last is the promotion of women's empowerment and peace building, and starting to, really use women as mediators and as peace builders, and recognizing their unique role there. So essentially, WPS applies, the Women, Peace, and Security applies to all aspects of peace building and conflict prevention. And this means that the goal of full and equal participation of women in all peace and security impacts, results in peace negotiation. The Somali women emerged as crucial peace builders during the Civil War. That women are included in peace agreements. This was representative signing a pledge to fight impunity to promote justice in Congo. That women are involved in support and peace operations. This is a group of Indian women in the UN peacekeeping forces to really start to recognize women's unique role in this, or even just equal role. And then, of course, elections. Demobilization. We, because we often think, again, from a gender stereotypical perspective, that it's men that's involved in the fighting. Women are part of these communities engaged in conflict, and therefore, to really engage them in the demobilization processes. To disarmament. Traditional justice systems. This has been another area really creating more sustainable peace and protection of human rights globally, where women's presence within transitional justice systems, whether it's the tribunal courts of Rwanda or Yugoslavia. Actually it was the court, the Rwanda Criminal Tribunal Court, where rape as a weapon of war and a tool of war was finally started to be recognized. So having women's perspectives and unique experiences within these transitional justice systems is critical. And then Reconstruction and reintegration. And I particularly love this slide because Nimruz, this province, is the only province in Afghanistan that's represented by 2 women, and it's the only place in Afghanistan where these women were elected outside of a quota system. So these women were completely elected by their representatives for who they are. In a region, where that's been developed, it's been a challenge. So let's look at why does SCR 1325 and the Women, Peace and Security agenda matter so much. There are currently 30 active conflicts in the world. More than half of all peace agreements fail within the first 10 years. And actually in the 1990s, 50% of negotiated peace agreements didn't make it to their 5th anniversary. Women are grossly underrepresented in peace and conflict negotiations. And of the 39 conflicts in the last decade, 31 represent repeated cycles of violence with a disproportionate impact on women and children. And again, to highlight, in the last 2 decades, women were less than 8% of the participants in key peace negotiations and less than 3 of the signatories of resulting accords. And sexual and gender-based violence against women and girls has been deployed as a deliberate tool of war, often with impunity, which means no prosecution or justice. Forced displacement associated with conflict exposes refugees, particularly women and girls, to additional risks of violence and exploitation. Evidence shows that increased violence against women can be an early indicator of conflict. And frequently, women hold critical knowledge about impending or escalating conflict, but are overlooked or unable to report their concerns safely. And an example of this was that in Kosovo, women had observed the growth of armed caches, but there was no one they could report to about their concerns. And similarly, women in Sierra Leone knew of plans to attack UN peacekeepers, but threats to their own personal safety prevented them from relaying that information. So recognizing that, that women are critical to even, to conflict prevention in those early stages, or as, they have information as indicators to conflict. And then there's a correlation between return to violent conflict and lack of health care, economic opportunity, and education for women. Women carry out much of the burden of rebuilding communities in post-conflict settings. However, when included as meaningful participants, women expand the scope of discussion to include a broader set of critical priorities required for just and lasting peace. And there's some just amazing examples of this. In Northern Ireland, women negotiators secured commitments in the 1998 Good Friday Agreement to involve young people and victims of violence in reconciliation, and to accelerate the release and reintegration of political prisoners, as well as to ensure an integrated education system and integrated housing. So, the women in this Good Friday Agreement were thinking about young people, political prisoners, and education and housing. Another example is in Guatemala in the 1990s. The Guatemalan women involved in negotiations to end a 36-year civil war secured important protections for labor and indigenous rights, as well as guarantees of a balance in civilian and military power. They also enshrined commitments to women's equal rights and participation in the peace accords. So again, you have, women's role in this negotiation really bringing in, a balance of civilian and military power, labor and indigenous rights. There's many more examples, and I wish we had time to talk about them all, but I know we're limited, so I'm going to move on here. And what is really the U.S.'s role than in this WPS agenda. And actually, it's been quite significant. Under its presidency of the UN Security Council, the U.S. introduced 3 of the 4 follow-up resolutions, 1820, 1888, and 1960. And the WPS has had bipartisan political support, within our Congress. In 2000, when UN Security Council resolution was passed, 1325 was passed, it was, under a Democratic administration. But in 2008, the Republican administration sponsored the follow-up Security Council Resolution 1820, which recognized rape as a tactic of war and threat to peace and security. And then, U.S. is really a major stakeholder in peace processes, whether that's, through its, contribution of military resources, financial resources, or, its ongoing role as a mediator and negotiator between conflicts and countries in conflict. So we were so excited when on October 26, 2010, at the 10th anniversary of Security Council Resolution 1325, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton announced the U.S.'s commitment to developing a national action plan on women, peace, and security. And at that time, she recognized that the only way to reduce the number of conflicts around the world, to eliminate rape as a weapon of war, and to combat the culture of impunity for sexual violence, and to build sustainable peace, was to draw on the full contributions of both men and women in every aspect of peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peace building. And over the next year, to fulfill that commitment, the White House National Security Staff assembled internal working groups from the Department of State, Department of Defense, Justice, Treasury, and Homeland Security, as well as others, to start to gather input on what should be in a U.S. National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. Additionally, government representatives in conflict-affected environments consulted women's organizations there in the field, as well as gender equality advocates and local government officials, to ensure that their perspectives and interests informed our U.S. NAP. And the interagency group also conducted consultations with representatives of the U.S. civil society, including women and peace organizations and congressional staff, to further inform the plan. Unique to the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, and really, to the framework of 1325 and its follow-up resolutions, is this critical role of civil society. And when I say civil society, or when civil society is referred to, it really means, it means teachers, it means women's organization, it means healthcare advocates, all members of a populace that's engaged, that has civic responsibility to our governance. And so civil society is often referred to as the groups, the organized advocacy groups that represent particular agendas. So the architects of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda really sought to address some of the historical gender limitations on women by requiring, in many ways, requiring member states to include women's organizations, civil society, and NGOs in this process of developing the national action plans and promoting and empowering women, women's equal participation in peace and security matters. And to maintain ongoing dialogue and consultation between civil society and governmental agencies here in the U.S. that drafted the U.S. NAP, there was 2 groups organized, one in D.C. under the coordination of U.S. Institute of Peace, which represents about 50 women and peace organizations. And in New York, there's a coalition of NGOs that meet regularly. And both of these provided input into the NAP. And also during the drafting phase of the National Action Plan, there was 5 consultations with women from all sectors of society that were organized throughout the country by the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And this culminated in a 36-page final report. So all of this input was gathered for the drafting of the U.S. National Action Plan. On December 19, 2011, President Obama issued an executive order implementing the U.S. United States National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security, which now means the U.S. is one of 35 other countries around the world committed to advancing the goals of 1325 and Women, Peace, and Security. And in the statement on national policy of in the Statement of National Policy on Women, Peace, and Security, this is within the National Action Plan, it says, the engagement and protection of women as agents of peace and stability will be central to the United States' efforts to promote security, prevent, respond to, and resolve conflict and rebuild societies. In executing this policy, the U.S. will be guided by the principle of inclusion, seeking out the views and participations of a wide variety of stakeholders, women and girls, men and boys, and members of marginalized groups. And in this marginalized groups, it refers to members of the LGBT community, women with disabilities, youth. It really is a very broad group. Third, the U.S. will ensure that the WPS agenda is coordinated among all relevant government departments and agencies and integrated into relevant U.S. foreign policy initiatives and engagement with international partners. And lastly, the U.S. government agencies will be accountable for implementation of the NAP. So this is a pretty strong statement, really kind of transforming how the U.S. has engaged in its foreign policy to how the U.S. is engaging in foreign policy, with really, the role of women, or empowering the role of women as central to this new direction. The U.S. NAP on Women, Peace, and Security, this is its objectives and frameworks. It has this national integration and institutionalization of a gender response, participation in peace processes and decision-making, protection from violence, conflict prevention, and access to relief and recovery. And I'll go through each of these one by one. So a national integration and institutionalization of a gender-responsive approach. Within the National Action Plan, there's a substantive concept of what this means. But then what I found particularly encouraging was that there was articulated outcomes. And there's articulated outcomes divided by agency, by department, really specific to the department of government it's dealing with. But these are the broad outcomes. So 1, establish policy frameworks to achieve gender equality and empowerment in all diplomatic, development, and defense work. That's huge, right? 2, through gender sensitivity trainings, enhance staff capacities for applying gender responsive approach at all levels. 3, establish mechanisms for accountability and implementation of gender-related policies. And 4, establish processes to evaluate and learn from the WPS initiatives. 2, participation in peace processes and decision-makings. Here the outcomes were that more women are effectively engaged in peace negotiations, security initiatives, conflict prevention, peace building. They noted formal and informal peace processes, because a lot of that negotiation really happens outside of formal processes, and to make sure that whether they're dealing with jirgas or community negotiations, that women are involved at that level as well. And then decision making during all phases of conflict prevention, resolution, and transition. And that the laws, policies, and practices in partner nations promote and strengthen gender equality at national and local levels. And as a lawyer, this is very critical, because it provides the basis for which women can really hold their own governments accountable when their rights aren't being upheld. So 3rd is protection from violence. Here, the number 1 is the risk of sexual and gender-based violence in conflict-affected environments is decreased because of the increased capacity of the individuals, communities, and protection actors to address threats and vulnerability associated with sexual and gender-based violence. I think this is really important, because it's one thing just to decrease it, maybe because you have more military personnel present at that moment. But this is actually saying that the reason this gender-based violence is decreased is because there's an overall increased capacity of community actors as well as protection actors. And then 2, again, laws, policy, and transitional justice systems have accountability mechanisms to combat exploitation, abuse, and discrimination against women and girls at national and local levels. And protection from violence is probably the biggest topic within the NAP. And so a third outcome is interventions are improved to prevent and protect human trafficking victims and survivors in conflict-affected areas. And fourth, that men and boys are better protected from sexual and gender-based violence and are mobilized as partners in prevention of SGBV. And this is an extraordinarily critical component that would be leaving out half the population if men and boys weren't included in these processes. Conflict prevention. Here the outcomes include early warning systems, gender-specific data, women actively participating in the preparedness and response initiatives, as part of this early warning systems, and that women and girls participate in economic recovery and have increased access to healthcare and education services. And similarly, the access to relief and recovery. It says gender and protection issues are explicitly and systematically integrated and evaluated as part of response to crisis and disaster. This is huge because in many of many past governments, let alone conflict-affected environments, there isn't even gender-based data to determine whether women and girls are protected through this. So here you're talking about a systematic integration and evaluation of how women are protected in crisis and disaster situations. And then 2, relief and recovery assistance includes enhanced measures to prevent and respond to sexual and gender-based violence. And 3, reintegration and early recovery programs address the distinct needs of women and men. And lastly, there's an accountability, as part of the NAP, and it's huge. And of course, as we all know, it's critical to ensuring that any policy is implemented. And here, the accountability that's outlined is that there's an interagency policy committee established by the White House National Security Council, and it establishes indicators to monitor and review actions taken in support of the NAP. The mechanisms will be established for regular consultation with civil society. Agencies within the government will have to report annually on the progress made towards NAP commitments, and this annual report will be submitted to the President. And in 2015, another comprehensive review of the NAP will be conducted in consultation with international partners and civil society to really look at, how this process has unfolded and what has worked and what hasn't and where to go forward. So I'm sorry, I missed a slide for you all. So what's next? Members of Congress and representatives of civil society met with Ambassador Milan Bavir from the U.S. State Department to discuss implementation of the U.S. NAP. And as we all know that without having the congressional act or legislation really supporting an administrative policy, if there's a change in administration or if there's a change, even in our Secretary of State, that, the policy might kind of get put in a drawer and really left there and not fully implemented or engaged. So our courageous members of Congress enacted the Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2012, and the bill was introduced simultaneously both in the House and the Senate, and on August 1st, 2012, so this is very recent. And the purpose of the bill states that it exists to ensure that the U.S. promotes women's meaningful inclusion and participation in mediation and negotiation processes undertaken in order to prevent, mitigate, or resolve violent conflict and implement the United States National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. I have to note here, since we are peace organizations, that it particularly encourages me, to have a congressional bill that its focus, it uses the word peace so many times. So let's move forward. What is the WPS Act of 2012 note? It expresses the sense of Congress that implementation of the U.S. NAP on women, peace, and security is paramount to improving the lives of women around the world and increasing global stability and prosperity. It notes that Congress is committed to advancing the goals of the NAP and outlines a role that the President should designate of the National Security Council to be responsible for promoting that NAP. The WPS Act states that it is now U.S. policy, well, when this gets, the bill passes, it would be U.S. policy to implement the NAP. The Secretary of State and Administrator of USAID as well should integrate gender into diplomatic and strategic and planning processes, and that all federal agencies relevant to our foreign policy shall ensure that the tenets of the NAP are incorporated into programs for conflict prevention, humanitarian and disaster response, peacekeeping, and democracy promotion. And lastly, the WPS Act urges the Secretary of State, USAID, Secretary of Defense, and other federal agencies to implement the NAP and ensure personnel training on conflict prevention, mitigation, and resolution that specifically addresses the importance of women's meaningful inclusion and participation. And actually, this advanced level gender training is at all levels. It's outlined to be at all levels within the National Action Plan, so kind of from your, on the ground all the way up to high level generals and officials. And two, that they facilitate partner government efforts to improve women's inclusion in peace and security processes, conflict prevention, peace building, decision-making institutions in conflict-affected environments. And that an annual report must be submitted to Congress by the Secretary of State, USAID, and Department of Defense. And this annual report must outline the monitoring and evaluations, tools, mechanisms, and indicators established to assess the progress on the objectives of the NAP. It must summarize all U.S. diplomatic efforts and foreign assistance programs that promote women's meaningful inclusion and participation, and assess the impact of such assistance. So, where does this leave us now? And to many ways, this is this is where we're at. We're taking us, the WPS agenda has really taken us up to August 1st with the introduction of the WPS Act within Congress and the Senate. And so now, what can we do as concerned citizens? What can we do to advance the WPS agenda and peace and securities? So Wanda is going to be introducing an action alert within the next couple of days that I know Kathy is going to talk to you a little bit about. And essentially, I think that, as usual, we all have to really function to hold our government accountable to effective implementation of the NAP. And that means at our local levels as well as our national levels, really looking around and asking the question, where are the women in the decision-making processes? How are these decisions going to uniquely impact women and men? Are we really taking, a perspective of bringing women's participations and diverse groups' perspectives into our peace and negotiation processes or in our daily decision-making that really make sure that, our outcomes are representative fully of our communities. So I want to thank you all for hanging in there with me today and listening, and I look forward to getting your questions. Thank you, Edzi. Thank you, Kathy. I'll hand it back over to you now.
Thank you so much, Tanya. That was a great presentation. Before I turn it over to Kathy to do the wrap-up, I just wanted to remind everyone how to submit your questions. On the right-hand side of your screen, you should have your attendee panel. Please use the question feature to type your questions, and then I will ask them aloud after Kathy does her wrap-up. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Kathy.
Thank you, Edzi, and thank you, Tanya, for that wonderful presentation. And I know you all have lots of questions that you're writing, so I'm just going to talk for a few minutes to give you time to do that and time for Edzi to accumulate a few questions for Tanya. And I did want to emphasize, as Tanya said, we are working to ensure that the Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2012 has as many co-sponsors as possible. One thing that we are really pleased about is that it was introduced in both the Senate and the House. And in the Senate, it had bipartisan support. So there are 3 Republicans on the Senate side who have initially sponsored the act. And you know, we're unlikely to see this move forward to, you know, floor action or anything like that this year, but it is terribly important that we take the advantage now to get as many co-sponsors as possible. And then that will really empower Congress next year to step up and take this a few steps more forward. So that's our goal right now, is to try to get as many members of Congress and senators to co-sponsor it. It's really a pretty easy ask, even in this very partisan environment. This is something that really has a lot of support, even you know, from Republican members, and it's not just the women members of Congress that are interested in it. We also have already a lot of male members of Congress that are co-sponsoring it, signing it on. It really is, it's one of the easier things that we'll ask you to do. And we know that action is our middle name, I say, and I know that all of our WAND members really like to take action, so we encourage you to do that. We will send you out an alert to make it as easy peasy as possible to send that message to your senators and member of Congress, so look for that in the follow-up materials. And now I bet that Udzi does have a lot of great questions for Tanya, so I'll turn it back to you, Udzi, for the questions.
Thank you, Kathy. We do. We have a lot of great questions. We're going to start with a question from Cinda Arsenault. Cinda asks, does the bill include any money for implementation?
No. I mean, not at least in the drafting language. I was scanning it with a fine-tooth comb, hoping to see some numbers in it, but not in the legislation as it exists now. Okay. So maybe that's something else we have to advocate for.
Thank you. Our next question is from Senator Sandy Pappas in Minnesota. Sandy asks, do you know if women were involved in peacemaking in South Africa?
Yes, they were. They were involved in building, actually, a coalition. I'm kind of talking off the top of my head, but it was significant. It was both in drafting the Constitution, but then it also brought it to women's legal rights and equal rights there. So women were involved in the peace processes there.
Okay, great.
And actually, Sandy, if you want, I have an exact example that I can send to you afterwards if you're interested.
Our next question is from Mary Kane. Mary asks, is there a petition that we can send to our members of Congress available?
Yes, so that is what Kathy was talking about, and we'll send it out in an action alert. I think it's going to be coming out within the next day or two, and it'll have those pieces both for the Senate and the Congress. And first, as Kathy noted, we're really looking to increase co-sponsorship of the legislation to continue to really give it weight, so that when it's reintroduced, it will be an easy passage. And just to note on that is that not only do we have, is the Women, Peace, and Security Act, the current co-sponsors are both men and women, I think almost equal, as well as it's bipartisan too. So we have a fair amount of Republicans and Democrats as co-sponsors on it.
Okay, our next question is from Suzanne Pierce. Suzanne asks, as far as accountability, is there any thinking on the international level about what kind of court or body women could appeal to if they feel their rights or interests are not being recognized in their home country?
There are. So this is a whole other webinar that I hope to do in the future. But the convention, the International Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, it's known as CEDAW. CEDAW has been ratified by every country in the world but 6, and profoundly sadly, the U.S. is one of the 6 that has not ratified it. So women in other countries, if their government is not either adhering to its own laws to protect women's rights, you know, or just doesn't have the laws in place, they can actually file a complaint with the CEDAW Commission. And where that has happened, it actually has been effective, at least in making the government take more responsibility. That's a human rights violation, you know, as opposed to a peace and security. There's also the Rome, well, anyways, I could go on. So if this, if you know, this person would like more information, I'm happy to talk offline with her at another time.
Okay, great. Our next question is from Adam Cohen. Adam asks, for those of us who are pushing Congress to end the war in Afghanistan, there are serious questions about what reconciliation with the Taliban and other groups will mean for the country's women, their ability to participate in negotiation and peacemaking process.
Right.
How do you envision implementing the National Action Plan to bring that conflict to a close?
Yeah. Adam, thank you so much for raising this question. It is a profoundly difficult question because, as you note, you know, many of us in peace work have been, you know, advocating for the last 11 years now, you know, to end the war in Afghanistan, and yet for us to do that and not recognize the potentially horrific, you know, results it could have on the women there, depending on how it unfolds, is, I feel, irresponsible. So Wanda has actually been really working through this this question, this challenge, with our partnership with David Kortreich and the Kroc Institute for Peace. And if you go to our website and go to, I think it's under Issues Afghanistan, there's the Afghan Women Speak report. And it interviews, I think it's something like 70 different Afghan women on how they feel specifically about this question. And I actually would prefer that they speak for themselves as opposed to me saying what we should do. Certainly the U.S. under the NAP is committed to ensure that, you know, that women's voices and perspectives are considered in our negotiation processes and how we choose to pull out. So we would be bound by our U.S. NAP policy to ensure that women are part of that decision-making process.
Excellent. Our next question is from Senator Nan Orrock in Georgia. Nan asks, who are the lead sponsors of the Women, Peace, and Security Act, and which Republican legislators have signed on already?
Great. So in the Senate, Congresswoman Barbara Boxer and Kay Bailey Hutchinson were the co-sponsors. And in the Congress, there was a number of them. So let me just actually give you the list. The co-sponsors in the Senate were Senator Scott Brown, Senator Robert Casey from Pennsylvania, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand from New York, Kay Bailey Hutchinson from Texas, Jean Shaheen from New Hampshire, and Olympia Snowe from Maine. And in Congress, the list is pretty long, but there's 14 sponsors there. Representative Howard Berman from California, John Conyers from Michigan, Eddie Bernice Johnson from Texas, Barbara Lee from California, Carolyn Maloney from New York, Jim McDermott from Washington, James McGovern, Mass, James Moore in Virginia, Christopher Murphy, Connecticut, Shelley Pingree from Maine, Janice Shankowski from Illinois, Jackie Spear from California, Nikki Songus from Mass, and Chris Van Hollen from Maryland. That's it.
And that information is also available on our website if you didn't catch all of those names.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Izzy.
Our next question is from Kathy Surgener. Kathy asks, which states need to be most encouraged to co-sponsor, and are there any regional or geographic differences in support for the bill?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, I don't know that there is. You know what? I actually want to refer to Kathy on that one because I know that she's a little bit more familiar with our members of Congress tendencies. But I mean, I think at this point we're looking mostly for bipartisan support and more members than not. But Kathy, do you have anything to add on that?
I think that's exactly right, Tanya. Really, with this, we're just trying to get an increased number of members. So it doesn't matter what state they're from. Everybody has sort of equal emphasis on this one.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Kathy, for jumping in there. We have another question from Cinda Arsenault. She asks, Tanya, can you talk about the Nobel Women's Initiative campaign to end rape and gender violence?
Very vaguely. So, yeah, very vaguely. There is an organized group of of women of the Nobel Peace Prize that have been coordinating and holding conferences on these topics. I know that they've been working on gender violence. I know that we were looking to bring them into talking about human trafficking a bit in relationship to militarism, but not fully. I'm sorry.
All right. Our next question is from Alice Dahl. Alice asks, how will U.S. voters be informed about the Women, Peace, and Security agenda?
I think that we have to get the word out. I think that, you know, sadly, even when President Obama issued his executive order to launch the National Action Plan, the amount of press it got was, you know, minimal, infinitesimal. So I think we just need to start talking about it, you know, and that's why this webinar and having these conversations are so important. Historically, or at least within the last, you know, 10, 15 years, maybe 10 years, you know, the U.S. really has kind of pushed away from international law and international agreements and really, you know, not you know, ratifying our human rights treaties. And so the fact that Secretary of State Clinton, you know, really committed U.S. to, you know, developing our own national action plan on this UN Security Council resolution, and then that there's been so much resources really put behind it. I mean, we're talking State Department, Department of Defense, USAID, Department of Justice. I mean, it's been an extraordinary amount of emphasis, you know, organized in the last 8 months around this agenda. So I think that we need to, I think that in and of itself is encouraging, and now we need to continue to talk to everybody we know so people start recognizing, you know, the U.S. as part of a global community and really being, you know, bound under these international commitments.
Well, thank you so much, Tanya. I think that's a good place to wrap up our presentation today. Thank you for the information you shared, Tanya, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. Just want to give you a heads up. We'll be sending out a survey tomorrow afternoon, and we welcome your feedback as we continue to put on webinars. And we'll also be sending out the action alert that Kathy Robinson mentioned, so please be on the lookout for that in your email inbox. As well as we'll be sending out a recording of this presentation, so if you'd like to watch it again or share it with others, you'll be able to do that. And we'll also let you know where to access a fact sheet on the Women, Peace, and Security Act and the National Action Plan on our website. We also want to let you know that our next webinar will be on October 11th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. That webinar is called Men Rule, and it's going to be discussing the underrepresentation of women in politics. So with that, we're going to wrap up, and thank you all again for your time and for joining us on the webinar, and we hope that you will join us again soon.